Picking up from the previous video about Duke of Gloucester, the steaming problems that this locomotive had didn't endear it to the crews and the drivers in the top link at Crewe North, and hence it was taken off the premier runs, the Midday Scot, the Royal Scot, and it was sort of relegated to lesser important trains. It eventually was withdrawn in 1962, again quite early on, like the first batch of clans, and it languished in Crewe North shed for quite a long time before it was planned, set aside for preservation. This in fact didn't happen. What eventually took place was that one of the cylinders was removed, and that ended up in the Science Museum in London without any particular sort of reference point, and there it is, I think, still now to this day, without any really proper context as to what it is or what it's doing there. The locomotive itself was, what was it? It was found. It was at Woodham's scrapyard, Barry scrapyard, but it was initially sold to a scrapyard in Newport. But for some unknown reason, the locomotive ended up in Barry, Woodham's scrapyard in Barry, and there it languished till the mid-70s. Now, it's just by one of those, I don't know, fate, call it what you will, that if it had ended up in its original place that it was, that it was intended to go to in Newport, it would have been scrapped, because the locomotives that ended up there were quickly cut up. But as most people are aware, the Woodham's scrapyard in Barry, the 250 steam locomotives languished for decades, a couple of decades, and most of them were retrieved. So one of them was actually Duke of Gloucester, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, this locomotive, since it was restored in the 1990s, has put in some astounding performances on the main line, and this is due to the dedication of the staff, who endeavoured to sort out and find out what the exact problems were. My theory as to why this locomotive never performed lies in the circumstances in which it was built. It was never part of the standard designs that are of the in terms of, it didn't belong to the whole sort of idea of the standard of the standard locomotive designs for British Railways. It was always deemed that the existing Class 8 Pacifics of the four companies that made up that were formed into British Railways would carry on in the top flight for some time, and there was no need for a Class 8 Pacific. That changed in the dreadful Harrow and Wealdstone collision in 1952, one of the worst rail disasters in British history, when a relatively new Pacific called Princess Anne, one of the Princess class, which had been rebuilt recently from the turbomotive experiment, was smashed and deemed irreparable. It was decided that it couldn't be fixed. Therefore, it was leaving a gap in the roster of a top-class express passenger locomotive for the London Midland region. Riddles put forward a proposal for a new Class 8 locomotive to be built, and special financial authorisation was sought. And this went ahead, but it went ahead slowly. Now, as each year went by in the 1950s, it was becoming more and more apparent that steam locomotives were going to have to be replaced. And there was a gathering momentum of evidence and pressure put on to start getting rid of steam locomotives and developing alternative forms of traction. And Riddle's and the executive and the structure of the Motive Power Department was completely changed. It became the British Transport Commission, and Riddle's resigned. And this locomotive was nearing completion. And I think somewhere along the line, the eye was taken off the ball. Interest was lost. And it was specified that the locomotive should have a double Carlchap exhaust. Now, these had been very successfully applied to the Gresley A4s and were subsequently being fitted to the Peppercorn Pacifics, locomotives which were dimensionally very similar to what Duke of Gloucester turned out to be. So there was that Carlchap double exhaust was linked to the draw and exhaustion of used steam from the three cylinders, and the operation and the way that the Caprotti valves ejected ejected the exhaust steam up the chimney, and the subsequent draw on the fire that produced. There was something different about the whole rhythm of how that operated, and without the proper drafting in the smoke box, then there was going to be a shortfall in the capacity of the boiler. So it was eventually fitted with a plain double exhaust. The other thing that was noted with it was when they came to sort of replace the ash pan, it was found that it did not match up with the drawings of and the blueprints of this locomotive at all. There was a mismatch. So there was a suggestion that the draw of air underneath a firebed had been stifled in some way. So that was another factor, because the firemen used to say that it didn't matter how much coal you put on the fire, it did not increase the steaming rate. It got up to a certain point, but once it got to that point, it didn't matter how much further coal was put on. It just didn't burn up and produce the heat and the evaporative capacity that was required, to feed basically, three cylinders and move a train in the manner in which it was supposed to. So there was all of these things, and the people and the organisation that took over the rebuilding of this locomotive did acquire the drawings and details of the Carlchap exhaust arrangement that was on Blue Peter, Peppercorn A2, which of course is in preservation. And they used that as the basis for putting a new blast pipe on it. So you can see then that there was quite an extensive effort to get this locomotive performing as it should. And in preservation, it's, to use their phrase, it's become a world beater. Certainly in terms of utilisation of steam in the cylinders, it's regarded as the most efficient steam locomotive, certainly in the UK, if not in the world. If there are any other locomotives that are better in terms of utilisation of steam, then, as I say, I've not heard of them. So I think the claim that they're making is probably got a lot of validity to it. So that was on Duke of Gloucester. The clans, the concept of the clans was the locomotive trials that took place in 1948 to determine what were the best practices of the four former companies, and then sort of deciding on a suitable mix of the best ideas to be built into the new range of BR standard locomotives. They were somewhat overwhelmed by the performance of the Battle of Britain and West Country Pacifics, which at that time were still in their original condition. Those locomotives in the 48 trials covered themselves in glory wherever they went, but they were in the mixed traffic category. They weren't in the top line, and of course they walked away with all the best performances. And they were somewhat, the committee looking at this were somewhat swayed by that, particularly the way that they performed on the Highland line in the north of Scotland. So they were way off their usual beaten track, and that somewhat influenced them when their idea of a light Pacific would be a good idea. And it's not uncoincidental that these were in the Scottish region and named after clans, and so there was some thought there going, well, a light Pacific could seem to do the job, but again it was the boiler just did not perform in the manner in which they expected. So that will be something for the society that's now looking to rebuild one of these locomotives from the ground up, to see if they can sort that one out. The Britannia Pacifics basically they did everything that was expected of them. Let's not forget they were conceived as mixed traffic engines. Yeah, they spent most of their working life actually working expresses, and they handle them generally with distinction. Their finest performances on the network were to be found in East Anglia in the 1950s. A large batch of them were used there. They were bigger, newer, and more powerful than anything that previously had been on that region. It was one of the Great Eastern region that trains out of Liverpool Street Station and into East Anglia, Norwich and Ipswich and Cambridge, was a bit of a neglected backwater, and the area did tend to suffer from very soft ground, which restricted the usage of large and heavy locomotives. So the services were somewhat wanting because they couldn't get the motive power to operate the trains in a way which would accelerate the services. I don't know whether there was any civil engineering that took place in the immediate post-war era in that region, because although the Britannia Pacifics were lighter than some of the LNER engines, they're still pretty big and had quite a substantial axle weight. Whatever it was, a large batch were there, and they performed really well indeed on the Norwich Expresses, the Broadsman, and I can't remember some of the other names of the Fenman, I think, and they relegated the B1s and the B17s and the B12s to secondary duties. The chap who put in the bid for them when they were being built, I think it was called Jerry Fines, something like that. He instigated an overhaul and rostering system at the running depots where they really got the maximum mileages out of the Britannias, and they performed very well. The mileages were good, turnaround was good, and the utilisation of engines which were built specifically to improve maintenance and mileages between overhauls was really demonstrated in their performances on that section of lines. They were there for a good 10 years until replaced by English Electric Type 4 diesels, subsequently known as the Class 40s. The other areas in which they operated in the 1950s, there was two on the southern region, as I mentioned before. They were always well turned out, and they did handle those trains with distinction. I mean, how they were there. They were there in the mid-50s, and where they went after that, I'm not sure. I think they ended up on the Midland region. The other areas in which they operated, there was a batch made towards the end with the large 1D tenders. They tended to go to Scotland, and they bore the names of Firths. So they worked turn and turnabout with the LMS rebuilt Royal Scots. Again, there was mixed reputation. Engine drivers are a conservative lot, and they tend to stick with what they know, and they're not really that enthusiastic about having new engines thrust upon them. When they've been used to working with other engines which they find can do the job. The difference between the reactions in the regions was interesting, and this was a problem with all the standard locomotives. Their nature was universal. Utility was the guiding principle. Excellence in performance was not necessarily one of the key objectives. Yeah, they had to be able to do the job, but it was utility, the ability to work anywhere and to do it with the least maintenance and with longer mileages. Now, whether that was achieved in the 50s is very doubtful, because the building programme was so slow. Don't forget that these engines were they were designed to that's right, they were designed in 1948, but it wasn't until 1951 that they started to come out of the works. And for the rest of the BR standards, they straggled out over the 50s right up until 1957, obviously with the 9Fs going up to 1960. And they ended up just being in small numbers in large sheds where there was loads of the other engines that they had to work with, which were being well established and well liked by their crews. The perfect example was the Western region, which did not like these engines at all. They were quite hostile, in fact, towards the introduction of Britannias on what was the former Great Western. There was a batch down in Plymouth Lyra, and there was a batch at Cardiff Canton. The lot at Canton seemed to be a bit more acceptable. Eventually what they decided to do was to get rid of them from Lyra and concentrate them on Canton. And there I think they did settle down and were accepted and did do a good job. But this is what I was trying to say earlier, is to get these engines to work effectively, the crews need to be familiar with them, and the only way you can actually do that is if you have large numbers of them. But when they're in sort of half a dozen here, half a dozen there, they become nobody's baby. No one's interested, and there was some BR standard class 5s with Caprotti valve gear. The ones on the Midland region, no one was interested. They needed special attention, and they needed, which they, in the declining situation throughout the 50s, they weren't going to get. So again, the potential was never realised. But the batch that went to Scotland up to, I think it was Aberdeen Ferryhill, they performed very well. The Scottish drivers and crews got really good work out of them, and they seemed to have the knack of knowing how to drive these engines, which again shows, just what the practicalities are of, building and designing steam locomotives. But by the time these engines were coming out of the workshops, the writing was already on the wall. It wasn't in 1948. There was a degree of optimism and enthusiasm about the introduction of a new set of standard locomotives which were going to be capable of operating right across the British Isles. So instead of having the situation of a cross-country train, say, coming from Newcastle going down to Bournemouth, which is possibly crossing three regions and what were three former companies, and having three engines take three engine changes at strategic points on the regional boundaries. Oxford being a case in point, York was another. The idea, if you had standard locomotives, crews would be from all the regions would be familiar with them, and that would result in greater utility and performances. Okay, so that's an overview of the BR Standard Britannias, and on that note I shall conclude this video and look forward to the next time when I hope you will join me and sort of looking at the next batch of locomotives I'll put on display. Okay, thank you for watching.